Week 32. Last week, I finished the implementation of the login procedure. In other words, the user can now log into the app. And this is done across all layers. What this means is not only that I implement the presentation layer, the user interface, the parts that the user interact with, but I also implemented the domain layer, which include the login and logout user use cases, as well as the data layer, in other words, the interaction with the actual repository. And the backend, I'm still using Superbase. It's been working fine for me. On top of that, because the implementation that I used particularly for this app is going to involve OTP authentication, I set up the Superbase backend for OTP sending, as well as the email sender for Superbase. Superbase can send a limited amount of OTP emails to your users, but if you really wanted to use it in production environment and have a higher volume, you'd have to set up your own SMTP server. Superbase actually makes it very easy to do that. So I set that up with Resend, which is another provider for email services. So now the user can interact with my app. The presentation layer interacts with the domain layer as well as the data layer to send requests back and forth to the Superbase backend. And Superbase can then use Resend SMTP service to send the OTP authentication codes to the users, and the users can then log into the app. So that's all done. It took me an entire week to do the login flow. Part of that is because I'm trying to stick to a very strict version of clean architecture. I made a mistake of not doing that in my first go around of the app, and I realized that the tech debt that accumulated made it almost impossible to actually debug effectively. So my second go around, I really don't want that to happen to my app. So a lot of it was sort of making the features work and a test-driven development, making the features work in the first place, and a refactoring. So it, for a single feature, took a little bit of more time than it would have, but I hope that the extra care I'm putting into the app can translate to better user experience. In other words, I'll ideally have fewer bugs, and also the debugging would be a lot easier down the line. One thing I also have to mention is the implementation also consists of the tests in both the domain layer as well as the data layer. In other words, all the logic surrounding the business logic surrounding the login use cases are thoroughly tested. What I'm currently missing in terms of the testing scope is the integration tests with an actual Superbase backend. Again, as I mentioned before, Superbase doesn't make it very easy to do unit tests in terms of mocking. They all use inline functions, which are, you can't mock them. So the current best practice in terms of testing Superbase is using an integration test approach such that your entire stack would actually communicate with a fake Superbase testing backend. On top of that, I'm also missing UI tests. UI tests is a bit tricky and sort of in the early stages of development for Compose multi-platform, as per my understanding. The iOS component for Compose multi-platform recently just became stable, and a lot of the testing tooling as well as documentation surrounding it and the community feedback are sort of still developing. I am admittedly taking a shortcut not to implement UI testing at the moment. It's another thing to learn, it's another thing to implement, debug. That would probably even more dramatically slow down my development pace. So I made the risky decision to bypass those tests for now, and I hope I don't pay for it down the line. But my rationale is that UI tests ought not to cut as deep. In other words, if something were to go wrong in my implementation, it's not business logic. It's not like mission critical, right? The data layer interactions with my backend services or the domain layer logic being all wonky and stuff. So I hope even if something were to go wrong, it wouldn't be catastrophic in the same way that if something were to go wrong in your data layer or your domain layer would. That said, though, ultimately I do want to put those things in because, again, they're important. Tests are really important. And I think I might have to wait till MVP comes out before I put those things in. So that's it. Last week I finished the login workflow. And next week I am working on the user profile. In other words, the very simple user profile page after somebody logs in. You know, what's your name, what's your account email, how long have you been with us, and so on and so forth. And this would mean that I won't need to implement a new repository because I'm still using Superbase Auth. So it should be fairly straightforward. And after that, I'm going to have to start thinking about the Superbase Postgres database implementation, which means I'm going to have to think about the schema, the row level security, and all of that stuff, which actually might take a lot of time. And yeah, because on the client side, I have to think about DTOs, how to map databases into objects in the app, so on and so forth. I'll be 2-3 weeks from now. So I'll cross that bridge when I come to it. That's it for this week. I'll see you next week.